Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today we are going to venture into the dangerous territories of North Korea, which is a topic we really haven't touched yet, but we decided to find somebody who is somebody who is bold enough to write about the topic. And why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and why it is that you're taking on the topic of North Korea sometimes?
So I teach U.S. foreign policy in Northeast Asia at Stanford University, where I've been here for about 12 or 13, maybe 13 or 14 years now. It seems like amazing I've been here that long. And for most of that time, I was the associate director of the Asia Pacific Research Center, which is a research center at Stanford looking at contemporary issues in Northeast Asia. And North Korea was a prominent, and Korea in general was a prominent subject for the center and for me. But prior to that, I was a journalist, and to some degree, I still dabble in journalism. And I spent a long time in my career in Asia, particularly in Japan. I covered Japan and Korea for almost 6 years. And before that, I was wandering through Asia for a long time. And then subsequent to that, after being a correspondent in Tokyo, I came back to the United States. I went to the Soviet Union and covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a pretty momentous event for me.
Sure.
For one thing, it definitely influenced the way I understood and looked at what happens to command economies when they go into crisis, and it's a sort of set of perceptions and a comparison I make a lot in looking at North Korea. I mean, I first started meeting with North Koreans back in the mid 1970s, so I go back quite a ways with this. But after I left the Soviet Union, I came back to the United States. I spent a lot of time as a journalist at the San Jose Mercury News, which was a night reader newspaper, and among other things, I wrote for a while a column on Pacific Rim and on U.S. relationships to the Pacific Rim. So I've been thinking about and writing about Korean issues for a long time. Just to say on a personal note, my father was a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, so Korea is very much part of my life since I was a young person. And I do dabble into writing about North Korea quite a bit. I'm careful, I hope, not to get too entangled in the rather fiercely ideological debates about Korea policy, although I admit that I do have some views I've formed over the years. So that's kind of my short introduction.
Okay, and we should mention, by the way, that your name is Dan Schneider. um,
I currently write regularly for Toyo Keizai Online in Japan, and I write about Korea quite a bit for a Japanese audience, and I enjoy the always fascinating interactions with Japanese when talking and writing about Korea.
okay, very good. Well, clearly, we seem to have come to the right guy. So, one of the things which makes me hesitate to ever write much about North Korea, and I'm sure you feel the same hesitation, is the question of epistemology. How on earth do we know anything how do we know what we know, in a sense? A society which is so closed off and where so much of the information seems to be based on rumors or people who fled from the country and may or may not be reliable witnesses and the various other sites. So, how is it that you feel that you're able to write about North Korea when so much of the information seems to be unverified or guesswork or something like this?
So I would say that, 20 years ago, you could make that statement about this sort of idea that North Korea is this hermit state, and we know very little about what goes on, and it's this sort of enigma wrapped in a puzzle, and so on and so forth. The old Churchillian metaphor, which I've mangled, but that's not been true for quite a while. Partly that's because There has been a flow of defectors that have come across, and over the years, first of all, I met with a lot of North Korean officials over the years, but I've also met with a lot of North Korean defectors of different types. And there's a large community now. I mean, tens of thousands of North Koreans who've come across. And, if you talk to enough people, you begin to assemble some pictures of what's going on inside. And there's some journalists who've done wonderful work on that basis. Barbara Demick's book, Nothing to Envy, she was correspondent in Seoul for many years, is a great example of that. But it's also the case that North Koreans themselves, and I talk to U.S. Officials a lot, people in the intelligence community, people in the State Department, elsewhere, and I talk to people in South Korea, and I've met many, many times over the years with people in South Korean government, either in the intelligence service or in the foreign ministry, who have lots of contacts with the North Koreans. There's a lot more flow of information coming in and out of North Korea than people seem to understand. And that, for example, because we have tens of thousands of North Koreans who are working in China as guest workers, as well as in other places. And there's a lot of cross-border traffic. So, for instance, the Bank of Korea, the South Korean Central Bank, has been doing studies of the North Korean economy for a long time based upon sending people up to the border areas and interviewing people who are there, not defectors, but people who are working there. And, there are lots of other things that people are looking at. We have market prices now from North Korean markets on the exchange rate between the won and the dollar, fuel prices, rice prices. We have ways of gathering economic indicators. So I think there's the idea that this is sort of a completely impenetrable society, I think is just wrong. I think the one thing we don't know, and where you get this sort of hyper sort of North Korean versions of criminology, is we have no idea how decisions are made within the North Korean leadership. And since this is a family-run dictatorship, if you will, no one has access to that level of insight into decision making. So that's where you get these kind of reads of, the sister of Kim Jong-Un appears. What does that mean? He disappears, and you get these flights of speculation that go on. And there, I think, we are treading into dangerous ground, and I tend to try and avoid that subject matter because it mainly, what you get more than anything else, is the wishes of those who are looking at these scenes, whether it's South Korean officials who are promoting their policy of engagement with North Korea, or it's people who are hostile to engagement. And, we had this huge, massive explosion of speculation about whether Kim Jong-un was alive or not. And this kind of thing, I think, tends to be somewhat fruitless. But I think that's a distinct part of the picture.
Okay, very good. So for those who are English speakers and who, have an ongoing interest in North Korea, what would you say are the 3 or 4 most reliable news services or periodicals that people should be checking in with?
Well, I think the one that's proved to be, I think, fairly professional and reliable for me has been NK News. And I think it's mostly behind a paywall, and they have a more sort of even more paywall protected site called NK Pro. There are a lot of good reporters there, and they have good sources in South Korea, a little bit less so in Washington. There is NK Watch, which tends to be more sort of defector-driven sites, if you will. I think I find it always valuable to read what the North Koreans themselves are saying. And KCNA, the North Koreans put out a lot on KCNA. And one thing I've always found, and I know from talking to friends who spend a lot of time in the American intelligence community watching North Korea, it's actually quite useful to read what the North Koreans themselves say, particularly if you do it on a regular basis. And often they're quite direct. And in some way, people say, well, it's propaganda. No, even propaganda tells you a lot. But often they're making very long and important statements there. So, of course, I watch what's in the South Korean media. That's a little less reliable. And, I think there are some Western reporters who follow events in North Korea pretty closely. People like Anna Feifeld, Chae Sung-hoon from the New York Times, I think, does a great job. There's a few others. I think the people in the Wall Street Journal Bureau in Seoul do a good job as well. So there's information out there.
Okay, well then let's move it to more recent developments. As I think we all know, in terms of the larger picture, some time ago, a year or two ago, there was for this moment, this thawing, especially when President Trump had his meetings with Kim Jong-Un, and he was portraying this as a giant breakthrough, although there was a lot of skepticism that basically he was just going for the photo op, but didn't really have substantial agreements. But recently, obviously, things have kind of gotten much more tense. So can you kind of describe what has happened most recently in these events, and a little bit about why you think they're happening?
Well, that's a rather huge question, but let me sort of give the sort of short version, if I can, recognizing I'm simplifying things.
Of course.
And I've spent a lot of time writing about U.S. policymaking towards North Korea, and I have had pretty good sources even during the Trump administration, with people inside the administration, amongst the sort of national security professionals. So my view is to some degree, and I've also spent a lot of time talking to Japanese policymakers, and to some degree as well in South Korea. So each of them have a distinct view of what's going on. But I think everybody understands that. So the first summit meeting in Singapore in 2018 was clearly, obviously, it was a big departure from the way things have been done in the past. It was a top-down summit without this sort of long process, usually of negotiating agreements ahead and preparing and setting things up. Not only that's the process for every summit, much less any process with the North Koreans. And that was thrown out the window in favor of Trump's, I'm just going to do it myself because, I know how to negotiate. There was a lot of Sturm und Drang leading up to that Singapore summit. We don't have to go into all the details of it. And there were a lot of people who were involved in doing the sort of working level preparation for it, who were trying very hard to create the basis for some type of at least partial agreement to underscore, to set up a longer process. But no one had the illusion that they were going to solve everything in one fell swoop. Maybe Donald Trump did, I don't know. But that process, very soon after Singapore, all the excitement and the photo op and the whole thing, it broke down very, very quickly. I mean, it broke down literally within a month when Pompeo went to Pyongyang and tried to nail down what did the North Koreans mean when they talked about denuclearization. And at no point along the way, and Steve Biegun, who's now the Secretary of State or Deputy Secretary of State, and who's still basically been running the North Korean negotiations, had admitted that on more than one occasion, that there never has been a moment where the United States and North Korea had a shared understanding of what denuclearization was or meant. And I think from the beginning, North Koreans had one idea of what they were doing, and the Americans probably had two ideas. There was the idea that the national security bureaucracy thought they were pursuing, and then there was whatever idea Donald Trump thought he was pursuing. And Donald Trump never engaged with the mechanics of actually negotiating a real agreement with North Korea. He favored the imagery was in some sense more than enough for him. So that there wasn't that process broke down actually quite early, and the second summit. Well, there was really, in some sense, three summits. There was also the brief meeting in Panmunjom, but the next major summit in Hanoi was, I think, a disaster waiting to happen. And everybody who was involved that I talked to could see that coming. The North Koreans never seriously negotiated, and there were many, many attempts to engage them in some kind of negotiation about a more detailed agreement, even a phased agreement. I mean, there's this idea out there that the Americans were always asking for everything to be given up in toto right from the start, and that's just not true. In some ways, that's a myth that John Bolton also helped to perpetuate, because he didn't like what the negotiators, as he makes clear in his book, he didn't like what the negotiators were actually trying to do, which was to get a step-by-step, a phased agreement of some kind. But they needed a phased agreement where the end point was clear and clearly stated, and there were certain pieces to that that were very important. That broke down really, really quickly, as we saw. And I think Donald Trump, in some ways, the North Koreans misplayed the situation. They asked for too much. They really wanted, more than anything else, all the sanctions to be lifted. That's been their goal, I think, central goal in a way, all along. They overplayed their hand, and then that's where Bolton, I think, had a certain ability to step into the situation. But I think Trump also saw that the risk was too high. But he would have been ready to make a sort of partial deal and declare victory. But the North Koreans demanded too much and more than he was willing to give. And I think at that point, and now we're talking last year, 2019, basically, and I wrote this at the time, that was it. That was the end of the negotiating process in any real terms. And even though, and you can see the statements that the North Koreans made after that, they went through a big reevaluation of this process. People who were involved in it disappeared. Some of them have never reappeared. Others were demoted and then since have come back. But they went through a big, sort of reevaluation, and in their style, that meant purges and other things. And I think they drew their own conclusions at that point, that the process, that they were not going to get out of this process what they wanted. And I think that in some sense has been true on the American side as well, although I think that Trump is desperate to preserve the illusion, at least, that, he has triumphed. He's made peace in our time. Look, there's no testing. There's no long-range missiles being tested, no atomic weapons being tested. So, he accomplished something. But I think that's why people are very skeptical that we now have a little bit of spin up again of talk about maybe trying to arrange another meeting before the election. But I think Began has already sort of shot that down. And although the South Koreans are promoting this idea, I'm very, very skeptical that it would take place. Too risky for even for Trump. But I think also the North Koreans are not that interested to go. They don't want to go back and repeat the experience of Hanoi. So,
well, let me stop you there. Yeah. So let's look a little bit at South Korea. Right now there seems to be a president in South Korea who is going just about as far as any South Korean president can go to try to, take a peaceful approach. And one thing which kind of is a mystery to me is, why are the North Koreans slapping this guy in the face who is basically their best shot at a good deal with South Korea? Because if they bring him down, whatever replaces him is going to be a more hardline regime, it would seem to me, in South Korea and Seoul.
Well, that I think a lot of people have the same question that you do. In the initial period, the opening to South Korea, which remember took place in let's take a step back. When Moon Jae-in became president in 2017, he very early on laid out this broad goal, very ambitious goal of engagement with North Korea. people talked about Sunshine Policy 2.0, that it was sort of picking up the threads of the progressive governments of Kim Dae-jung and
Ro.
Nung Woo-hyun, and those, I think the North Koreans did not initially respond to that. In fact, and they were desperately seeking to get to meet with them. They only picked it up after the end of the beginning of the next year, and that's after all that escalatory rhetoric between the United States and North Korea, fire and fury, threats of pushing buttons, multiple tests of missile systems and nuclear weapons and nuclear warheads, and then suddenly at the beginning of 2018, the New Year's speech that Kim Jong-Un gave, they flipped. And they flipped in part because people believe, and I think this is, I share this belief, that they had done what they wanted to do. That is, they had demonstrated, and I think it's very important, that these tests are not merely political signaling. They're not fireworks going off. They're very clearly attempts to demonstrate that North Korea has a survivable nuclear force, survivable deterrent of their own, if you will. Well, they tested all sorts of things, including multiple launches of missiles, which clearly meant at the same time, clearly meant to signal that they could overcome missile defense systems, submarine launch systems, large city-busting warheads, and so on. So having done that, then they turned around and said, okay, now we're going to focus on the economy. And then they engaged with the South Koreans, and we had the Winter Olympics and the visits of the North Korean leaders to that, and then that followed with the North-South Summit. I think initially they were very interested in certainly encouraging and responding to this attempt to engage, but even then, they were more interested in using the South Koreans to get to the United States. They've always tended to look at every South Korean regime, whether it's a progressive one or a conservative one, there's a certain element of disdain. And don't forget, these, in some sense, the two Koreas are still in a profound contest for legitimacy, to prove that they are the legitimate, the real Korea, the authentic Koreans, if you will. And the North Korean view has always been, in some sense, to disdain the South Koreans as being lapdogs and puppets of the United States, even progressive governments. I think in one sense, South Korea was a way to get to the United States, and it worked. I mean, that opening to South Korea led to the Singapore summit. And when, however, the South Koreans proved that they could not deliver the goods, if you will, that the North Koreans were seeking, particularly the lifting of sanctions, I think they basically brushed them away. I mean, it seems illogical in some sense, but in some ways it's quite coherent with a long history of between the two parts of Korea, if you will. This is not a new phenomenon. I think now it's an interesting moment because they want the South Koreans, I think, to break with the sanctions regime. I think the North Korean leadership has given up on the idea that the Americans are going to deliver the goods in that regard. And I think the economic situation in North Korea, and I wrote about this most recently, I think is far more severe than people realize. And there was a good piece, I thought, in the New York Times today or yesterday along these lines as well. I think that they came back to the South Koreans, and in usual fashion, by escalating pressure on them and by trying to put pressure on their relationship with Washington, because they know that they're not going to get from the South Koreans what they need economically unless the Blue House is ready to really break ranks with the U.S. and with the United Nations sanctions regime. So far, they haven't been willing to do that, and the North Koreans in their statements and propaganda keep on basically poking at that you actually are lackeys. You don't really do anything. You don't do anything the Americans don't want you to do. So they're constantly pushing at them. And I think that it's an interesting moment because the South Korean government, the Moon Jae-in government, having won a big victory in the National Assembly elections in April, they have a clear, uncontested majority in the National Assembly now. If they want to, they can make this move. And we just had a reshuffle in the South Korean government, and every post that was filled, the new unification minister, the new national security advisor, a couple other people that were posted, are all meant to signal their absolute, almost obsequious desire to engage with the North Koreans. But still, I think for Pyongyang, the question is, how far are they willing to go? And I don't know, I don't think we've hit the point of no return in terms of a decision on the part of Blue House about, where they're going to go on this.
Getting up to really current stuff, what's going on with COVID-19? Has this impacted the situation at all on either side or both sides?
Well, so this is what I wrote about most recently. I think the COVID, my somewhat slightly, sardonic, but nonetheless, I think sincere argument was that if you want to, people were speculating a lot about why this recent turn and this harsh rhetoric coming from Pyongyang, and a lot of speculation about the role of Kim Jong-un's sister and the hardliners, the sort of criminology of looking at who's up and who's down. But I said the real cause is COVID-19, and as I explained it, is that it's not that they have a massive epidemic. We don't know that that's the case, but they clearly were terrified by that possibility, and they had a reason for that because they'd experienced previous problems with SARS. And I had a long conversation. I don't want to identify the person, with an old friend who's been doing, development and relief work, humanitarian relief work in North Korea for a couple of decades. And this person had been fairly recently in North Korea and was very familiar with the healthcare system. And the person said basically that the healthcare system was so fragile and so, really under-resourced that they were terrified of that this thing's going to spread. And as a result of that, they very early shut the border down with the Chinese, and the Chinese also shut it down from their side. This was in about the third week of January that they sealed the border, and they had to do it from a epidemiological point of view, but the economic consequences were significant because 90% of North Korean trade is with China these days, and more importantly, key goods, energy, food, chemical fertilizers, planting seasons coming up, all those things were heavily, and more importantly, North Korean exports to China, coal particularly, and other minerals, as well as some of the other things they use to earn currency. Those all got severely cut back. I mean, and you can see even in the official trade data, the graphs are dramatic, just off the cliff, collapse down to near zero levels within weeks. So I think that is a huge driver for the North Korean regime at this point. And they tried to carry out a currency. They had, the North Korean economy is this kind of odd hybrid. And again, as I said, I spent some time watching the Soviet Union trying to go through the process of reforming its economy. So I see a lot of things I've seen before, but it's this hybrid of market and state. But the main enterprises, the large enterprises, are still state-owned enterprises. Although there's no clear 5-year plan process anymore. So the command economy is broken down to a large extent. There's been a lot of marketization from below as a consequence of the fact that the ration system, the distribution system, even the ways which factories procure inputs and so on had broken down. The market stepped into that. But it's a very tense relationship. There are a lot of people making money in North Korea by engaging in the being middlemen and bringing goods from China, including inputs. Plus, there are a lot of currency traders. Uh, all that created a kind of dual economy, a shadow economy and an official economy. And the North Koreans, in order to keep the won dollar rate stable, which they have for the last 5 years or so, in order to prevent hyperinflation, which is a huge danger in a shortage economy like that, they had to basically heavily restrict the circulation of the North Korean won. So they actually have budget fiscal shortfalls, as well as shortages of hard currency, because particularly since the cross-border traffic was being cut off. So in May, they instituted they called it a bond measure. It's the first time they've done this in 17 years. But basically, it's a confiscatory bond measure. It's an attempt to force, in some ways, to create another currency, if you will, because you could pay for goods using the bonds, but to force factories and people who are hoarding hard currency to trade them in for these bonds. And it met with, from what we can see, with some significant signs of resistance. So I think they're in the midst of a serious economic crisis. It'll get worse around now, because this is always a time in North Korea when food shortages develop, because it's in between the using up the harvest from the previous year and waiting for the coming harvest. I've seen some reports that the Chinese have opened up the borders a little bit, and there's satellite evidence of trucks crossing the Yalu and so forth. So it may well be the Chinese have started to step in and into the breach, but I think the fact that this is an economy with a underlying systemic crisis, but also an immediate crisis, I think is undeniable.
Okay, well, in order to give our patrons a chance to ask a few questions, this will be my last one, and this is always my last question. Is there something that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you, that you think should be on this section is the part that goes on YouTube? So is there anything else that really needs to be said before we move to the off-the-record Q&A?
Well, I think that the thing I always keep coming back to, and we just talked about it, is that people tend to, particularly this happens in the United States, but I think it also happens in Japan, tend to think that everything the North Koreans do has to do with us. They're signaling to us. They're trying to meet us. They don't want to meet us. It's always about us. And I think my, sort of the experience I've had with Korea over many years, and I refer to both Koreas in this regard. Mostly Koreans are thinking about Korea. They're thinking about themselves. And they're not as obsessed with us as sometimes we are with them, if you will. I think that's probably true of lots of countries. Americans are completely myopic, but everybody else in the world thinks that Americans walk around thinking about them. They don't. Americans barely give a thought to anybody else. But Koreans can be like that as well. So I think that the internal dynamics, both the internal dynamics in North Korea and the inter-Korean dynamics, are always, for me, the primary drivers, not what they are thinking they can get from the United States.
Okay, excellent. So now we will move on to the patron Q&A. We have